Guys, very good to see you and welcome to this session. The reason for us being here is because we've all read the news around Nike, and there's a particular thing going on there. They are in a pretty bad situation, as the numbers show. And as this company is very close to our hearts for multiple reasons, I thought it would be good to meet up and exchange some thoughts on what has happened and what's the way forward. How could maybe Nike come out of this stronger? But maybe even more important, what could other people facing similar challenges learn from what's going on there? So in our conversation, I'd hope to distill some learnings for everyone to enjoy. And yeah, let me first introduce you both. I've known you for quite some years, both of you. Let me start with you, Hans. You've been part of the Nike company for over a decade. Well, maybe even like half your life, as you were also sponsored by the company before. And you were part of the brand and storytelling team. And I still remember that I've seen you presenting the Nike story. And I think it was for a bunch of retailers or brand managers. I'm not really sure. And I still get goosebumps when I think back of that story. And in that story, you also had a particular point where you talked about the comeback of Nike. I think it was around the time of Michael Jordan. So maybe there's some learning there that we can discuss later. So part of being part of Nike, you were also a sports guy. You've been part of the Olympics in 1984 in LA, 1988 in Seoul, South Korea. You used to run 10Ks under 30 minutes, which I find like out of space. And I think you've been the national Dutch champion for 10 years on the steeplechase. So yeah, there's quite some achievements there. But I think above all, I know you as someone that really lives and breathes innovation and brand. So great to have you here. Is there anything that I forgot? Anything you would like to add?
Well, this is good enough. Thank you.
Good. What are you most proud of, actually?
Most proud of in my life? Most proud of my son, who will turn 18 next month.
Oh, wow.
By far. Athletically, yeah, being participating in the Olympics is the biggest achievement that any sportsman can get, and have done that twice. Yeah, with each passing year, I look back on that achievement with more admiration, let's say, and surprise that was actually me that did all that. So it's like a different person. I'm looking at myself as if it's a different person. But yeah, so definitely, athletically, I can always be better, but fine, happy, content. Yeah.
Amazing. Yeah,
Absolutely.
good. And people can read about it actually in one of your books. On let's share the book in the comments later. My other guest is Mr. Howard Yu. He is the Lego Professor of Innovation at IMD, which is one of the top business schools in the world. And at the IMD, he runs, listen, the Center for Future Readiness, which I think the name in itself is already super inspiring, and the work that you do there equally inspiring. You're the best-selling author of the book Leap, How to Thrive in a World Where Everything Gets Copied. It's on the table over here. You used to work for and collaborate with Clayton Christensen. You appear on CNN. You've been published in HBR. You are part of the Thinkers 50, and I could keep on going. So very proud to have you here, and looking very much forward to share some perspectives with both of you on what happened at Nike, which I give a bit of context on later. But anything from your side, Howard? Anything that you would like to add?
It's just great to be here, and I remember when we met and we spoke about also the ecosystem and the next generations as well. I think all these topics are very, very important as we unpack the saga at Nike.
Yeah, definitely. Cool. All right. So for those who haven't seen what happened, during their last earning calls, Nike lost about 28 billion in market cap, and that was based on a couple of announcements that they made. So, for example, they expected 10% less sales while we were standing in front of the summer of sports. The Olympics were coming up, which is usually a time where sports brands do very well. They announced a cost-saving plan of 2 billion. They had their lowest share price since 2018. Their stock price fell 12%. So all kinds of numbers that show that Nike was in a situation. Now, that said, and I think you all agree, we do need to pay respect to Nike because it is still the #1 sports brand in the world. They have a phenomenal history of, building culture, innovation, athleisure, and everything. So very curious to hear your perspectives to the Nike case. So maybe Hans, maybe I can start with you. When you read about the news, and I know you've probably been discussing this with former colleagues or maybe even with people that are still within Nike. What stood out for you? What are your observations when you hear and read about what's going on at Nike?
Well, what was interesting is that it was, well, you may call me an old school marketeer, perhaps, that which is kind of odd because I do believe in the power of innovation and even disruptive innovation, right? So, but at the same time, I do believe in certain parameters to be in place. So to me, and it was not really a surprise because Nike quite early, really from the moment that the new CEO was put in place, because he embarked on a program of quite, very far-reaching changes. One of which was to basically do away with all retail. And it was the retailers that from the beginning really were the power base and the fundamental base of Nike's success. Because these were the guys that told the stories to consumers coming in, retold the magic of the company, worked their butt off, 5, 6, 7 days a week to sell the shoes. They were the champions of the brand. And they were basically, in one movement almost, sort of put aside. And we understood why, because I was also in discussions, about 20 years ago about, how much of a pain in the neck, retail can be, because they're always complaining, they're always they take, a certain chunk of your margin, and, so who needs them, right? So there were all these scenarios being discussed, even almost 25 years ago about a world without retail. But the severity with which, this latest measures were put in place, we were worried that the link with the consumer, the human link with the consumer might be lost. Consumers looking for a product, going into a store, they've been told the story, being told the quality of the product. That was really basically just wiped out. I would have much preferred to go direct to consumer, but keep the specialists, the true warriors in place: basketball, football, running, you name it, and the larger sports stores, fine, So it was not really a surprise. What did surprise me was the incredible severity with which it happened. Right, it really fell apart. It really fell apart. That was, but we some of us saw a little bit of writing on the wall because it did happen in the past. It happened in the early 80s. It happened in the 90s. It happened, 20 years ago. These fundamental changes that really caused some serious business problems. But Nike always rebounded from that, and even a positive person like me have serious doubts about whether we can rebound from this and how we should.
Yeah, let's discuss that later on how we could come out of it. But I think what do you think got lost other than the link to the consumer and the relationship with retailers? I mean, you've been part of that culture. You've been, I think, chief storyteller, or I don't know what it was called back in the days. But can you tell us a little bit about that Nike feeling or that Nike culture of the past?
Nike's first value and prime value has always been innovation. Innovation based on an intimate knowledge of the consumer. consumer broken up, in categories. So you get your football, you get your soccer, you got your running consumer. We knew these folks intimately. We knew exactly what that world looked like. We knew what they wanted even before they knew themselves what they needed, right? So Nike came out with this carbon shoe and runs, whoa, sounds pretty cool. So never really doing much market research, but intuitively feeling where the market is heading into. That I always thought was one of the most brilliant aspects of Nike's character, and of Phil Knight's character, almost predicting the future. What might happen, next year? What are the trends telling us? What will the world look like in a couple of years? And then go after it with full force, with a disruptive force, and make it happen, right? So I always thought Nike's powers were to anticipate what might happen tomorrow and then go after that, not just a little bit like some brands would, but with full force. And that doesn't always work. There's been plenty of failures, but I think those elements combined is what made Nike Nike, and what made Nike into this surprising brand that always come up with something new, right? And I remember discussions with really old German retailers way back that were sort of cynical about Nike's power from time to time, but they said, you guys will always come back and surprise even me. And we did, always did. That power, among other things, has in a significant way, I think, has been lost or has been jeopardized. Let's say there's still brilliant people working in the Nike innovation kitchen, as they call it. I know them personally, fantastic people, but as a whole, the company has just moved away from that intimate connection with that very specific consumer, and then you don't innovate anymore. And then what was your USP is more or less diluted.
Yeah, true. I'm curious to unpack that a little later in the conversation. Like, how can you bring that back in an organization, and how do you make that sort of measurable? Because it seems that the company is trying to measure everything, and going online helps you to measure a lot, to quantify a lot. But if you talk about that magic and the intuitiveness and the intimate relation, that's almost something so intangible that it's very difficult to pitch that to management that is looking at numbers.
And I do think you need both. I mean, there was a time where Nike didn't really have any sort of rational thinking. Then quite a lot of McKinsey folks started entering, the offices, and they rationalized everything. But it was always a mix of both. Mm-hmm. Of that intuitive thinking backed up by some numbers and some anticipating and some business sense, really. But it seemed that it has sort of skewed a little too far to the other end now. Where it always was a healthy balance. In the old days, it was just intuitiveness, and then that didn't quite always work. So they brought in that business sense, and I think you need a healthy balance of both. My feeling is, and I don't think I'm the only one, is that it has sort of, the pendulum is swing way too far to the other end.
Right. Yeah. So what's your assessment, Howard? What do you think has shifted within Nike?
Well, I think for outside casual observers, how quickly the tides shift, right? You remember the pandemic. Everyone is praising how great Nike is, and what praises is direct to consumer, letting go of B2B, the traditional retailer, as a magical touch, and until it doesn't work, and so. For us as executive outside the fashion industry in general, it is a humbling key lesson learned. One is when an organization perhaps pursuing easy growth, it may not be a good idea. Not all kind of growth are the same. And then the job for leaders is to slow things down. I think one thing that caught up, like Hans just described, is they forget about the importance of their domain knowledge. What makes Nike so successful is the intimacy with athlete, the deep understanding of different sports category, unlike a company like Under Armour or Syra or H&M, right? It's just men and women. But what Nike is really strong at is to understand the leading athlete in badminton. What do they want and what do they need? And I tend to call them domain knowledge. And the temptation in the wave of disruption is completely forgetting about your past. And I think that's perhaps one of the key lessons learned. Whether it's automotive, people talking about EV and autonomous driving and battery, it is new capability any car company needs to embrace. But let us not, take the Nike lesson to the heart. That what you know today is actually quite important for you to reinvent. And I very much agree with Hans' assessment. It's maybe the pendulum. It is a key lesson learned about when the pendulum swing too far, when we forget about what we learned in the past, that could be a danger.
How would you, or how would any other company, how can you recognize the pendulum swinging? What are typically things that happen in an organization when you as an innovation guy or a brand leader needs to pay attention?
I think one thing is momentarily, let's unpack a little bit. How does the management team behave or the discussion? But I think when an organization start not having a healthy debate, that becomes an issue. When there is almost a doctrine, this is the brave new world, we need to raise ahead. Or sometimes you see organizations fall behind because they dismiss all the new trend as something of a distraction. But I think one of the leading indicators is to observe the kind of dynamic of a management team debate. Are they able to bring opposing view and playing not just devil advocate, but advocating other opposing view when you need to commit resources to irreversible choices, when you shut down retailers or when you lay off employee? These are irreversible choices. Either that knowledge is gonna disappear or not. So under these particular one-way door, Jeff Bezos would call it, that you cannot come back, are there healthy debate or people kind of price artificial harmony and sweep all the debate under the rug? And so I think these are the leading indicator that managers need to be aware of.
Yeah, very good point. I see you're laughing, Hans. Do you recognize that?
Yeah, I can't really say if that's true because I'm not privy to board meetings and management meetings in particularly in Beaverton in the world headquarters. You do hear quite a bit of rumbling, and of course there's been various reorganizations where particularly a lot of the, let's say, the elder management, a lot of the elder employees have been laid off basically. But I agree with Howard. Another indicator could possibly strong indicator is basically consumer responses. What does the consumer say? And the consumer, you go online, you go everywhere. Consumer in this definition my definition here would also include the retailers. Yeah, they're really saying, they're not here anymore. They don't listen to us, and it's that usual rumbling and grumbling and complaining that happens every 10 to 15 years with the company of Nike. And then Nike was always, able to buy their way back in, to repurchase that lost goodwill. But I think that's another thing you hear right now is basically that. It's this, where are you? You've lost us. We've lost you. Are you still there? No. And the bad thing is that no, they're not there, but their place has been taken up by other brands. Therein lies a serious danger.
Yeah, totally true. Howard, you are running the Center for Future Readiness, and in one of your pieces of research, we see that Nike ranks high up on the fashion industry. I think it's #1 in the last measurements. Can you tell us a bit about how do you score a company's future readiness, and what do you expect for then next year's assessment? Where do they go off the path?
Yeah. So one way of measuring future readiness is what you want is essentially a 360 assessment. You don't want to be too much beholden just by the share, the financial market, like Warren Buffett always says, right? In the short term, it's a voting machine of popularity. In the long run, is it weight on the substance. And so if you assess an organization, whether they're future ready or not, you sort of need to looking at the financial fundamental, their cash flow, their cash and debt, share price performance obviously is one, but you also want to understand, oh, okay, so what kind of innovation trajectory they have, and also their relative position across other competitor at the same time. And as a result, you roll up all the 30 variable or so into a composite score, and to assess their relative position against companies such as Adidas or New Balance or other smaller brand, for example, Under Armour, etc. So out of these relative positioning, and this is where Hans would love your opinion on, but I think the opportunity for comeback is actually there, because this is not Kodak. This really is not. In terms of the financial balance sheet, you just see, I mean, it's the largest footwear organization on the face of the planet. Now, we heard about New Balance is stealing market share because of B2B, and there are smaller brands like On Shoes, but they are fraction. They're really fraction of the global industry. Now, I'm not saying complacency is not a major issue. Of course it is. But if you stack up from technology, from supply chain transparency, and to the market share against the second largest one, Adidas. So if I forget about the brand itself, if I just put company A and company play, and if I think about if this is not a fashion industry but banking, how would I assess the ability for company A to come back? Well, from this data point, it sort of tell us still there is quite an optimism around, although there's not saying there's not much. There will be a lot of pain involved. So this is how I see from an objective perspective. Yeah, there is still a great leverage for the organization to mount a comeback. Now, of course, future readiness is always a snapshot, and what I predict probably could only forecast for the next year, and it really depending on now the critical moment. Can they mend the relationship with B2B, for instance? Could they continue to come back with building a stronger relations with key opinion leader? For all the data ability and direct to consumer, could they leverage a little bit more to pacify the retailers' relationship? So these are the critical move that would foretell how things unfold in the next year or so.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Any reflections on that, Hans?
Well, no, I was interesting to hear, the future readiness concept. I always thought that Nike was always ready for the future, because that was really part and parcel of how they operated. Like, as I mentioned earlier, right, the ability to see trends happening, to understand consumer behavior tomorrow, even though the consumer themselves might not even realize, in what direction they're moving into. And that enthusiasm and faith in the brand to go after what needs to be done with full force, with a disruptive force. Nike's past has been filled with comments from competitors, business analysts, those who claim they know, with phrases like, Nike, you can't do that. This is really it. You've done everything, but this is the limit now. You can't go any further. The history has been filled with comments like that, right? Many times people said, look, you're stupid. Don't try that. It won't work. And Nike said, fine, we'll see what happens. And they went after it anyway. And again, sometimes it doesn't work. But it's the
Can you give an example, Hans, of such a...
Well, even, I think the nicest example is when Nike, it was about 30 years ago, decided to centralize distribution. Every brand on the planet had a distribution center in a separate country, right? So ASICS had a distribution center in Holland, in Germany, in Belgium, in France, in Italy, and everywhere, right? Because you're close to the retailers. That's what you do. Nike realized that that's very inefficient. That it costs money, and they came up with an idea to build a central European distribution center somewhere in the middle of Belgium. And everybody said, no, that's not going to work. That's just not going to work. This is the end of you. And they did it, and now it's almost like industry standard. You know, way back, things like Nike Air, which was actually first introduced to Adidas. I'm not sure if you guys were aware of that. It was the inventor. First brought it to Adidas, and they basically laughed him out of the office. He brought it to Nike, so we don't really know what to do with it, but let's try it, right? So it said that willingness to always try something new and then to go after it with full force and the support of the whole organization. That always is, to me, always been the sign that Nike was always future-proof because they basically made the future. Right? They come up with things that no one could even think of. Yeah, and again, that seems to be lost somewhat because that
I love how that relates to what Howard mentioned, right? So if I summarize, Howard, what you mentioned is, I think it's in one of your articles or your books, you always talk about place big bets but hold them loosely. And if I look at the organization, they placed a big bet on direct to consumer, and maybe they didn't hold it too loosely. They were too strict in doing that. And by trying things like you mentioned, Hans, like going out and just do it, they might come out of that stronger. And I was also wondering, and you both talked about losing touch with consumers. So my assessment was that, of course, direct to consumer flies during COVID. I mean, you're not allowed to go to the store, so it flies. And I've always wondered, like, I remember when COVID hit our society that there were lots of consultancy firms and trend watching firms that said that everything was going to change. Whereas if you look into sociology, any sociologist could tell you, or any psychologist could tell you, that after a certain moment of time, people fall back on their old behavior. Things turn back to normal. And so we kind of could have predicted that COVID was maybe just a bleep, a short moment of excitement on the direct to consumer track, and then that could fall again. And another assessment of mine, and I wonder what you guys think of that, is that they are after youngsters, Generation Z. And for a long time, Hans, you know that Nike was about, if you have a body, you're an athlete, right? Mm-hmm. And now their Olympics campaign was winning isn't for everyone. And I found it quite astonishing that, a young generation that struggles with mental health issues, that is under so much pressure, that you change that narrative to winning isn't for everyone. We raise the bar even further. And it might be aspirational, but I think it's inaccessible anymore. So you're distancing yourself a bit from the consumer. And both these stories, the COVID shows me that you don't maybe really understand consumers, or winning isn't for everyone doesn't really relate to Gen Z. And, I'm not part of the company. I wasn't there in the briefing, so they probably did a great bunch of research on that. So maybe it's unfair for me to judge, but it kind of feels that they're a bit distant. Now, relating that to placing big bets and trying new small things, what would be the way forward to then try new things and to get back into that innovation spirit? Any thoughts from any of you?
Key lesson I've always learned is listen to the consumer. Don't go out and do interviews. Be part of that consumer world. Again, I can't remember ever that we went out and interviewed people and find out what people wanted and stuff like that. And, because then you usually get your middle of the road vanilla sort of answers that don't really, push the bar any higher. But to be so much a part of that consumer base that you intuitively understand what they want. That, I think, is the first step back. It's the first step back. And if they've done that, and I think your example of that the latest Nike campaign, you're spot on. And again, old timers like me, compare that one with the one in 1996 that read, winning silver is losing gold, that had its fans and certainly its critics. It's very harsh. It's all about winning. It's all about intensity. And this latest campaign really doesn't fit within the current trend, but I somehow think that perhaps Nike briefed the advertising agency, well, whatever you do, make sure you do something different from everybody else. And all the other brands are going after inclusion and sort of the softer elements. And so, what's left is this. And yeah, Nike definitely stood apart. I didn't like it. I can think of anybody who really liked it. I don't think it really hit home. Certainly not with Gen Z. I'm not sure who it hit home with. But it's almost symptomatic of that loss of context and really that common sense behavior that you have and you really understand the world you're operating in.
Yeah. Okay. So more intuition, better listening, and Howard, how do you get back on track?
Well, so there's also depending on the degree of freedom of the organization, right? Because if you are trying to be future ready, if you try to reinvent yourself, inevitably company is going to make some major mistakes from time to time. Netflix, they have some major mistakes in the past, and the Reed Hastings, they go streaming too fast, and so the share price actually lost for almost half for about 6 months, and it come back up. Facebook similarly, when TikTok is on the rise and people think, oh my God, Facebook is losing the Gen Z, the Gen Alpha, it has no future. And Mark Zuckerberg also, revised their forecast, and the share price lost quite a while, and then it come back, right? But bearing in mind, in both cases, the founder CEO also have the controlling vote of the organization.
Right.
So although they are publicly traded, the CEO will never get ousted. So they make mistakes. Thank goodness, the CEO are also quite retrospective and for whatever way, right? So then they absorb the lesson learned, and so the company is able to stage a comeback. Nike, I think the ownership structure is slightly different. It's much more of the typical S&P 500 organization, meaning their share price is much more distributed, or their share is much more distributed to outside. So that quarterly pressure, as experienced by the current CEO, is quite different than Mark Zuckerberg or Reed Hastings at the time. So mounting a comeback becomes the degree of freedom maybe a little less in the case of Nike. So this would be, it comes down to whether the board will continue to support the CEO, and the CEO is able to convince the board that whatever painful lesson is being learned, this is literally, like you said, right, Aljan, multi-billion-dollar lesson learned. And so let's absorb. We're gonna, and there are some leading indicator, right? They bring back some of the veteran coming back and trying to mend some of the relations with retailers as well. So this is the dilemma, slightly different. But again, like Hans mentioned, if an organization stay future ready, there's bound to be mistakes. So from a governance structure, how do we make sure when something inevitably is going to fail, how much room for maneuvering we have? We cannot just talking about innovation without the ability to fail.
And how do I, so if I'm listening to this conversation and I work at a certain corporate that went to a similar transition or faces similar challenges, how do I sell that argument of let's give freedom, do more on intuition? How do I sell that to a board or to a CEO? Because it's hard to put in an Excel sheet, right?
Well, so one thing is, first of all, be very clear when this decision is being made, how much we could back it out. So, if something you go forward and you don't like it, you could back it out. As much as possible, think about plan B as well. So when do we call this is not viable? We're gonna pull out, and what is the contingency plan? Oftentimes, not even at the board level, at the operating level, I've seen manager is they have one plan and there's no plan B, even when it involves substantial uncertainty, and that's sort of like not okay. Second is, if this is a one-way street, right? Then have a healthy debate. We mentioned earlier that you need to have different opposing view to challenge one another, so that the course of action the chance of success is, hopefully is higher. After all, leaders get paid because they make the judgment most of the time is right. And even at Amazon, it's like leaders are expected to get the judgment right most of the time. And this is why they're leaders.
Mm-hmm. There's some things in the business that you don't always talk about. I know that Nike has a very large, it's not even a sustainability department anymore, but that sustainable thinking is filtering through the whole organization. So absolutely, I might even think it's one of the forerunners in sport business. On is probably taken over. There's some smaller brands that are more agile, I think, but Nike is definitely, all the things you mentioned, I think that was definitely part of the overall plan, and still and it still is. But it might have been a little bit sort of buried under the overarching strategies of going away from categories, going to direct to consumer. It seems that the business element, the operational element, seems to have overtaken almost that human touch, that branded element. It's still there, but it's not as pronounced anymore because maybe it's not as important anymore. I think it's all about margin policy and quickness to consumer and that, and the story, which is really what you mentioned, is still there, but it might not be as pronounced, or it might not have a chance to come out anymore because it takes a lot of effort to do that, and it's perhaps not so important anymore. Where in the past that was the campaign, and now everything you talk about is sort of the business strategy, overall business strategies. That seems to be what people are talking about, that Nike finds to be important. Mm-hmm. Making this direct to consumer work seems almost more important than telling a good story and coming up with the latest innovation, which doesn't seem to help them much.
But we need both, right?
Of course you need both. But as I mentioned earlier, that pendulum might have switched a little bit to the one end, and perhaps right now, and again, I can't really say because I'm not privy to those meetings, but the people, the management and the middle management seems to be more on that side, or let's make this work, and the people, the consumer voice and the innovation voice might have been not as pronounced, or not even in the greatest numbers, or maybe at board meetings or management team meetings every Monday morning. They might raise a finger maybe once in a while and say, "Oh, we got some great shoes." Where in the past that was the first thing you did.
Yeah.
Right. So the relative importance. I think Nike still has everything a company needs. It's still the biggest on the planet by far. They still yield 4 or 5 billion pre-tax. I mean, and Nike has come back from serious disasters that everybody said, "All right, it's done for now." I can show you newspaper clippings from 1980, 81, 82, where the business, even the Wall Street Journal said, this Rebel brand is done for. It's out, gone, bye-bye. We'll never see it again, right? 3 years later, boom. So I have great faith that whatever they do, they will bounce back. I have no idea how, but they will, because there's still too many good people in there. But I think it might very well be that the conversations at the weekly management team meetings go about 80-90% of business and efficiency, and only 5% about the product. And in the past, that was almost reversed. So that balance needs to come back somehow, I think.
And this is such an interesting observation, particularly in the age of like AI and advanced automation. And so with so much efficiency and productivity gain, the danger is manager getting, enthralled by these, shiny things and forget in the end the purpose of the enterprise, right? And that gives the edge. What is product, whether this is marketing, whether it's building relations with your community, that is actually the engine for growth. And that's probably what AI cannot replace yet.
Yeah, I agree. In the future, possibly, yeah, undoubtedly, but not.
Oh, you think so, Hans? You're a romanticist. You're a human being. Do you think?
Yeah, but no, but I'm also a realist and a firm believer in progress, and that whatever great innovation tools and toys we have nowadays in 10 years to be outdated. I tell my son from time to time, I said, look at your iPhone. In 10 years, you look at the same iPhone and you smile because you go like, oh, this is a nice, cute little thing. Because in 10 years, we get something that we can't even imagine. I'm a firm believer in progress, that things will happen and things will move forward for the better, by and large. But and the same goes for Nike, absolute faith, but you do need the right people to make the right decisions. And if you don't, then yeah, it's very thin ice that you're threading on. As they had in the past. Again, as I said, the company had been on the verge of basically falling over, more than once in the past. And here is another, it's still not falling over, but there's a trend going that needs to be reversed. Otherwise it could be in dire danger in a couple of years. So people were complaining, this is a bad shoe and it's clunky and it's expensive, but it's the only thing there is. So that's an opportunity. Nike said, we're going to do things differently. Better, we're going to listen to you, we're going to make it lighter, we're going to do all of that. And we're going to innovate relentlessly and continuously. That is really the basis of who they are. Listen to the consumer and bring them stuff that they couldn't even imagine the day before. That, I think, is the sole purpose why Nike exists. And its prime USP. Go back to that. Or basically reinvent yourself completely, like a Nokia did, right? They went from, chopping wood to making telephones, right? So, but barring that, if you want to stay active in the sports business, look at your original purpose. What is your prime USP? And go back to that again. That might have been lost a little bit, or it's still there, but it's been buried under an avalanche of, let's say, other things. Right.
If there's anything for everyone to take into, account personally, is like, complacency is really our biggest enemy. Yeah. Right. Because even such an iconic company can make mistakes.
Right.
Who couldn't? We've seen Starbucks is going through similar challenge right now. And so the list go on. Right. And you're king until you're not.
Yeah.
Let me use that.
I like that word, complacency. Yeah, sit still and you're dead. This is not complacency at Nike. It's almost the other way around. It's just want to be too active. I just think the direction that the activity is taking place might just be, perhaps needs to be reconsidered. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. All right, guys. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with me and for everybody that is going to enjoy this conversation. It was great to have your unique perspectives, the Nike history, the brand and the storytelling, the innovation and the future readiness. So thank you very much. And I hope to see you soon in real life, both of you.
Okay.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Great to be here.